be announced on March 11th. Washington Journal continues.
A live shot of Mount Vernon this morning will take you there in our next hour of the Washington Journal. But before that, we're joined by F.H Buckley, back at our desk, George Mason University law professor, author of his latest book, American Secession, The Looming Threat of National Breakup. You argue in this book that secession is a lot closer than we think in today's America. What do you base that argument on?
Well, partly it's my experience. I mean, look, I moved here from Canada and I went through all this before, and I remember how at one point this was something nobody talked about, and then a few years later we're having a referendum and it nearly passes. So we're in a very divided country. In many ways it resembles the country I left, and you begin to wonder whether or not we might be just better off with, two separate countries. It's not what I want. Actually, I feel a little bit like the skunk at the garden party. All these people have been talking about great presidents, and here I am talking about a breakup. But ultimately, I'm not arguing for secession. It's just the opposite. I'm saying it's a real threat, and we should think about that, and maybe turn down the volume a bit.
A passage from your book: we're less united today than we've been at any time since the Civil War, divided by politics, religion, and culture in all the ways that matter. Save for the naked force of the law, we are already divided into two nations just as much as 1861. Describe what those two nations look like and where they are.
Well, every morning the Washington Post arrives on my doorstep, and it seems to me like a fresh argument for secession. It just drips with contempt on the other side. There's a lot of that. I think what's missing is a tolerance, an understanding of people with very different points of view. When you don't have that, when half the country thinks the other half is deplorable, you have to wonder, why do they belong? Why should they be in the same country?
You say in your book that there are the bonds that still hold America together. They're strained right now, but they're there. What are they?
Well, maybe they're more strained than ever in a long time in the past. We have a common culture. It's a world culture, but it's a common culture. If Americans see each other in a foreign country in Europe, we'll recognize each other as Americans. I mean, we're loud, okay? We're ebullient, we're having fun, okay? I mean, that's very American, I love it. But at the same time, we're canceling a lot of our culture, we're canceling a lot of our history. We're told that we're not supposed to be proud, rather we're supposed to be ashamed of our history. That's very divisive. I mean, if you want a country, it's very important to have the same kind of mythic heroes, and also to forget a lot of the bad stuff.
What can we fall back on right now?
Well, if it ever comes to it, what I'm hoping would happen would be a realignment of the country in some way. I mean, you have to imagine that one state will say, look, this is not working. For example, we'd like to have national health. We're not going to get it from Washington. We might get it from Sacramento and a smaller group of states. We don't think we'd like to make America great again. Let's make America small again. And if you do that, then maybe things like national health become possible. And then you get a referendum, and at that point, people have to sit down and talk. And what they may end up talking about is, letting different people go their own way, but maintaining still a united country in some respects. So it'd be a different kind of federalism.
Bigness and smallness come up in your book, the advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah.
Smallness being what might happen if American secession happens.
Right.
What are the advantages, and which does the balance favor?
Well, this was a big debate for our framers in 1787. Nationalists like Madison wanted a big, big country. When I looked at the evidence, when I looked at other countries, what I discovered is that bigness is badness generally, and small is beautiful, and smaller countries are, less corrupt, freer, even more prosperous. So we're comparing, the biggest countries in the world to places like Denmark, and those countries, those Denmarks, are doing pretty well.
Frank Buckley's our guest. The book is American Secession, The Looming Threat of a National Breakup. It's our discussion point for this hour of the Washington Journal today. You can join us as you have all morning long on phone lines split up regionally. It's 202-748-8000 if you are in the Eastern or Central time zones. It's 202-748-8001 if you're in the Mountain or Pacific time zones. And again, we'll keep that text line open, 202-748-8003. We'll start with you this morning in Wilson, North Carolina. T-Bone, our guest. Good morning.
Yes. Good morning, C-SPAN, and everyone out there. I think the greatest threat that we have right now is that we have not updated the Constitution to reflect the times of the day. The Constitution was written by man. Man is fallible. It's not a Bible. And it made it very easy for Russia to come in to interfere in our elections. For example, we got this electoral college where we only got like 7 states that you really got to go and campaign and win to win the presidency. Now, those states have got the less educated people. You know, it's very smart people in those states, but they are very easy to fool or gullible because those people are not. In other words, they need we need a national election, the same rules for every state. We don't need to have this thing so complicated.
Professor Buckley.
Well, the Electoral College was a big topic of discussion back in 1787 with the framers. They thought that it was important for states to be represented, to give the states a voice, and, you know, that's what we have. And yes, you're right, it's darn hard, virtually impossible to amend the Constitution, so we're pretty much stuck with it. Frankly, that was something that a guy called Roger Sherman from Connecticut gave us. He should be probably a hero for conservatives because the Electoral College cuts their way. That's just an accident. It didn't have to happen that way, but that's how it's turned out. You know, if you want to get a constitutional change, you know, it would probably happen most likely with a threat of secession, which would initiate a discussion between the seceding states and the rest of the country as to how you divvy things up. I mean, you know, a state may want to go its own way with respect to national health, but we may not want to have, for example, a passport to visit Disneyland. So those are the kinds of discussions you have to have.
Play it out a little bit more, as you do in your book, about the routes to secession if it were to happen today. You make the argument in your book that you think Americans today would be less willing to fight to keep the Union together like they did in the 1860s.
One hopes there's no crazy South Carolina out there, okay? I don't think we'd see an Abraham Lincoln in office. We were going through in the earlier hour the list of the best and worst presidents, and very near the bottom was James Buchanan, the president just before Abraham Lincoln. A lot of things wrong with Buchanan. In an era full of racists, he was about the most racist of all, but he said something that made a lot of sense to me. He was talking about South Carolina trying to secede, and what he said is, look, this does not make sense. You know, we're prosperous, we're doing well, you have no right to secede, and you have no reason to secede because you want slavery. Slavery is nowhere better protected in the world than in America at this point. Only you still want to secede, and what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to send in the troops? I think if we can't keep our country together by ordinary bonds of affection, we're not going to keep it together by sending in the army. James Madison said the same thing. He said, you know, if the federal government invaded the state, the compact between the states would be over. And yet when my Alexandria was invaded, it was federal troops that got in. Now, don't get me wrong, the Civil War usefully, thankfully, ended slavery. But we don't have those issues today, so I can see a civil war over slavery, but I don't see a civil war over transgender bathrooms.
The caller talked about those people when he was talking about another state. I want to go back to Gary Gallagher, author and historian, gave a speech last year talking about northern and southern perceptions of each other, what they thought about each other and whether perception was reality in the years leading up to the Civil War. This is what he had to say.
We can argue either way, and historians have, that people were more alike or more different, but I think often overlooked in this debate about similarities and differences between the sections is the fact that substantial numbers of white Northerners and white Southerners believed that there were profound differences. In any era and circumstance, perception usually trumps reality in dictating behaviors because people act according to what they perceive to be the truth, however that perception might differ from reality. By the eve of the Civil War, many Northerners saw in the South a society fundamentally, and many would have said perniciously, shaped by the presence of slavery. For their part, innumerable white Southerners thought Northerners an antagonistic and meddling people determined to undermine the South's slavery-based social system. It mattered little whether a real chasm separated people in this way. The New York Daily Tribune put it well in the spring of 1856, quote, "The truth is that though we are but one nation, we are two peoples. We are a people of equality and a people of inequality. These two peoples are united by a bond of political union, but whenever a collision comes which brings out the peculiar characteristics of the two, they are seen to, they are seen to be as unlike as almost any two civilized nations on the face of the earth." That same year, in 1856, a young North Carolinian, a cadet at West Point, son of a slaveholder, offered the Southern viewpoint. "Our manners, feelings, and education are as if we were different nations," he wrote. "Indeed, everything indicates plainly a separation."
Frank Buckley, are we two nations today, or do we think we're more different than we actually are?
In many ways, we are two nations. I mean, pick up the, as I say, the New York Times or the Washington Post, and you're reading stories by people and of people very different from people in the other parts of the country. I think we could still get along, but I think the speaker just now hit on something very important, namely that it's really very psychological. There was a Convention of Estates in February 1861 to try to patch it together. They thought, it's crazy, we don't want to go to war, let's work things out. Remarkably, the Northerners offered to put slavery in the Constitution. The most anti-slavery people said, we'll make it so slavery will always be part of our U.S. Constitution. Abraham Lincoln said he'd go along with that. But it didn't work. One of the Southern delegates said, that's not enough. You also have to respect us. And you have to respect our slavery. And the Northerners said, no, we can't do that, right? So, that need for respect is always there, and never more than today. And I think it fuels a lot of the, frankly, nastiness of our politics, the willingness of people to go to either extreme.
The book is American Secession, the Looming Threat of National Breakup. Phone line split up regionally. Shelley's out of Eden, Utah. Good morning. You're next.
Thank you for taking my call. I just want to say respect is very important. And also the fact that we have a president that bullies everybody all the time, that doesn't help our common denominator of getting us all together. I'm a great-grandma, and I have 18 children or great-grandkids. I truly believe there is a better life for them, but the way the direction we're going, the middle class is being gone, and we're just having the rich and the poor. So we need to find a happy medium line. We need more middle class than we do the rich and the poor. Thank you for taking my call.
Thank you very much. Those were good points, and congratulations on all those grandkids. I think what you've done is you've described both why people like and why people dislike Donald Trump. I don't want to get into politics, but you're talking about some rather basic issues that helped elect Trump. And at the same time, you're talking about, the way in which a lot of Americans, half of Americans, think this is about the worst thing that happened. Let's put it this way. In 1972, Irving Kristol said the culture war is over, the left won. Only in 2016, the left kind of got a wake-up call. Maybe they didn't win that culture war after all, right? From 1992 to 2016, there was a broad consensus that we're not going to shake things up much. Well, now we are, and with Trump, and that's helped to produce the divisions I'm talking about. So I'm not going to take sides. I'm just saying, hey, those divisions are there.
What are the biggest secession movements in America today?
Well, they're all over the place. There's something called Calexit in California. I think if it happened this time, it'd be politically correct. There are secession movements here, there, and everywhere. You know, Texas, New Hampshire, Vermont, Oregon. So they're small now. They always start small, but they can build up very quickly and surprise you.
If it happened this time, I think they'd be politically correct. What do you mean?
What I mean this time is, rather than defending slavery, it might be, you know, the wokier states of the Union saying we can't take it anymore, and let's make America small again.
To Herbie out of Moss Point, Mississippi. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I think you're hitting on it. It's about racism and the haves and the have-nots. The haves telling the have-nots what they need. Now, I'm in Mississippi. We have a rebel flag. We have a big problem because the whole thing that holds America together is holding down black people, not in being in control of those particular groups of people. We are the people that have brought freedom to America. We're bringing justice to America. And when God said that he that is last shall be first, now when we moved to the first position, black people started looking out for one another, giving themselves everything that they need instead of depending on America or a white man to give it to them. Then white people have to look out for their own people. It's the haves trying to tell the have-nots what they need. And this is where the problem is. And black people are on the rise. And this is why the states will try to secede from the United States, because I live here in Mississippi. The rebel flag is never talked about. We're the only little state that fly the flag, and we misuse blacks here, and we ignore it. We worry about illegal immigrants. We worry about Iraq, Iran, and everywhere else.
Got your point. That's Herbie this morning out of Mississippi.
Well, thank you very much, Herb. I mean, you're making good points, although I disagree. I mean, the goal actually, I think, should be for all of us to be treated equally, so no priority to anybody. That means maybe looking more carefully at people who've been hard done by. But in general, you know, the message has got to be we're all equal in this and we all count in the same way.
Who's Don Livingston?
Don Livingston is a weird guy, a very nice guy who is a secessionist. He's a philosopher, he's a student of David Hume, and he's somebody who, you know, from a philosophical perspective, likes the idea of secession. There are those people out there. He lives in South Carolina. He's not a racist in any way, shape, or form, but he is somebody who's talked up the idea of Southern secession and Southern distinctiveness. So he's a good example for me of the people who want secession.
To Nevin out of Port Charlotte, Florida. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Earlier, when you first started your broadcast, you mentioned the Washington Post. Can you repeat that statement about everything you pick up Washington Post? What exactly?
You know, I didn't make that up.
He asked you to repeat what you're reading when you pick up the Washington Post. And Nevin, forgive me, you were going a little bit in and out, but
oh well, it's just that for the last couple of years, there's been not just a decided anti-Trump slant, but also a slant that tends to communicate that people who support Trump are, you know, kind of less than human, and that bleeds over from the front page to obviously the opinions to the sports sections even. I haven't seen it in the weather section yet, but it's pretty much all over the paper.
Nevin, if we can hear you, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, I'm really surprised that you would say that about a newspaper that's historically been reporting facts and historical accuracy. The news section from their op-ed are two separate things, and your use of the word deplorables just goes back to see what your bias is. I mean, you're obviously a conservative, and are you hoping for secession? Is that what you're actually hoping for?
No, not at all. In fact, the book was written in opposition to the idea of secession. I just said it's out there. And there are things we should do now to remove that threat. And one of the things is to tone things down. I stand by what I said about the Washington Post. I think in many ways it's a great paper, but it's a paper which underwent a real sea change with its new owner. It's not, I mean, the New York Times, for example, tries, I think, to be more moderate in its views, but let's not get into the Post.
Randy in Millington, Michigan says, it seems that your guest would like everything fast food style in our government, and that's not how it works. It's long, it's slow, it's frustrating, but it's our American way. We have loud and contentious debates, but when push comes to shove, we come together as Americans.
Well, I hope he's right, okay? He's right about all of that. I mean, the structure of government is made to prevent bad things from happening. I mean, you have to go through a bunch of hoops. It's not like that in the parliamentary system. In many ways, the parliamentary system provides, you know, better results, I think. What our system lacks is a reverse gear. You get bad stuff enacted, and then it can't be amended.
What did Brexit, the Scottish independence movement, what did that mean for secession in America?
Not anything, I think. Not anything very much. I mean, people tend to look to Europe right now for this, that, or the other thing, and we're different. We're Americans. We don't have to look abroad. But for the Brits, Brexit was a form of regulatory reform. And so when I think about it, gosh, you know, there are all these people here who might welcome secession. I mean, they include people who, you know, want to go their own way with respect to national health. But there also are a lot of people who think that we're in a regulatory morass, that we're being ruled by unelected regulators. And what they're talking about is the Code of Federal Regulations and the alphabet soup mix of agencies in Washington. I mean, those kinds of people might prefer a smaller country with, you know, less of Washington's regulations.
To Rory out in California, good morning.
Good morning. I believe that capitalism and Trump go together, and every man is capitalism while Trump is in office. And there's one other thing, too. And this I reluctantly have to say. As for immigration, there comes a time in every nation, all nations, when you no longer want immigrants to come into the country. You just have too many. And when you're paying them instead of them working to make the country better, it just doesn't work.
Well, I agree with a lot of what you said. I don't, that we're straying from the topic a little bit, but you know, I wouldn't like to see zero immigration. Hey, I'm an immigrant myself. I mean, you know, there is always a tendency for immigrants, we get in here and we pull the ladder up, nobody else after me. But immigrants are a source of value to Americans. The immigration debate, I think, should center around whether or not the people we're bringing in are actually making native-born Americans better off. But that's a different debate.
What is secession light?
Secession light is what I was thinking might be a solution to our problems. Secession light I described as a greater grant of authority to the states or to a group of states over a whole bunch of issues. It's what the Brits offered Ireland in the 1880s. It's the way in which all of the former British colonies that left peacefully, you know, gained their independence. It's a form of self-rule. So maybe, rather than just breaking up the country, maybe the thing to do is keep the country together, but allow the pieces, the different parts of it, to have greater control over what they want to do.
Is that legal under the Constitution?
Everything's legal under the Constitution if you amend it, right? So yeah, so what I'm contemplating would be something to get the game going, which would be an act of secession, and then that, you know, that begins a discussion. No state has the right of secession, right? No state had that right in 1861, and they don't have it today. Why? Because the voters in other states count too, for example, dividing up federal property, dividing up the federal debt. So it begins a series of discussions. And maybe what might come out of that, which would bring peace to our debates, would be a greater tolerance for different parts of the country going their own way over any number of things. I mean, it might be abortion and it might be national health.
What role would the Supreme Court and Congress play in what you're talking about if a secession movement is declared and we start walking down that path?
Well, inevitably everything ends up before the Supreme Court, so that's a good point. What would they do? There is an 1868 case which says no right of secession. That was decided when the Civil War was good and over. If secession was prospective, if it was in the future, I think the Supreme Court would hesitate before giving a loaded gun to the president. And also the originalists on the court would pay attention to the fact that the framers thought secession was perfectly possible.
We're talking with Frank Buckley. The book, American Secession, The Looming Threat of National Breakup, his newest book. Joining us for another half hour this morning. If you have phone calls, phone lines split up regionally, 202-748-8000. If you're in the Eastern or Central time zones, 202-748-8001 if you're in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, and 202-748-8003 for your text messages as well. If you do send those, please include your name and where you're from. Jim is out of Cheyenne, Wyoming. Good morning.
Good morning. Mr. Buckley, I'm concerned that the lack of understanding in the country currently about the Electoral College, why it was why it originated, and the discussions about eliminating it pose a threat to, could fuel more secessionist activity, and I'd just like your thought on that subject. Thank you.
We got the Electoral College because anything else would have been a deal breaker for many of the states, for the smaller states in 1787. We had a compromise on a lot of things, and some of the things you might not like, slavery being an obvious example, but that was kind of the price of getting a united country together. As for the Electoral College, you can make a lot of arguments for it, you can make arguments against it. Obviously, it runs up against a basic norm underlying our Constitution, and that's democracy. So the idea of one man, one vote across the country, totally inconsistent with the Electoral College. The framers knew that, right? They had to argue against people like Madison, who didn't want anything like that. The framers, most of them thought, well, we don't want small states to be swallowed up by the big ones. The big ones back then were Virginia and Pennsylvania. The big ones today are New York and California. Same argument.
Jim on Twitter is one of our longtime viewers. He often tweets every day. This is his comment on this segment. Maybe we could start to respect the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment, of course, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people.
Well, maybe that'd be good, only it's kind of late to bring the 10th Amendment in. It's not had too much staying power. It's not influenced the debate very much. I agree. I'd like to see more devolution of power to the states ultimately. I think that would go some way towards solving our problems. I don't know that the 10th Amendment is going to take us there.
To Dave in Hale, Michigan. Good morning.
Good morning. Mr. Buckley, my question to you, I've been kind of juggling this in my mind about the primary election. Why is it that we couldn't amend the Constitution on the fact of a secret ballot that the Republicans put up 7 electors up there in the primary? Democrats had 2. I'm an independent, so it doesn't matter to me what your thoughts are in a way. But what I'm saying it is a secret ballot, and then they keep it as a secret ballot until the general election, and then they open the ballot, and then it becomes into play. That way everybody has, it kind of evens the political side of the situation for both sides, and then and their vote may count and it may not count, just like a regular person off the street. So your comments, please, and I'll get off the air with you.
Dale, I value your comments. You make some good points. You kind of lost me, however, when you said, why couldn't we amend the Constitution, right? because that is so very, very hard to do, right? 38 states. I think that there probably are a lot better ways of ordering our elections, and inevitably there's going to be some messiness in them. But in general, I think we've got a system that, you know, we can take a great deal of pride in. With all its messiness, we still do a pretty good job.
Kevin, Owings Mill, Maryland, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. I'll definitely make a point to purchase your book. I believe that this secession is going to be economically driven. I think it's just as the Soviet Union. I think the United States deficit is at a point where it's just getting tremendously out of control, and it's going to at some point implode on everyone. But I think that before that happens, I would see a secession, a new currency, and some other things to get us from up under the financial issues that we have. I'm hoping that this secession is not a bloody secession, not a violent secession, but something that's controlled. And like I say, I think it will be economically driven. The Soviet Union was, I think when they became Russia, they no longer were indebted. And kind of got a clean slate as far as their international financial issues they had. And I see the same thing happening here with us.
You make some good points, and I agree with much of what you said. I'm glad you brought up the Soviet Union. I mean, the thing is, just about every country in the world is staring down a secession movement, and I don't know why we think we're immune from that. I would think we're primed ready for it, in fact. With respect to the economic consequences, you know, it's really hard to just break up if you don't take your responsibility for your part of the federal debt. I mean, that would be a serious problem. And secession movements in other countries have been willing to talk about that and negotiate over that. So that's kind of, you know, the price of exit, as it were. You've got to do that.
A Politico story from a few years ago looking at U.S. independence movements inspired by Brexit. You already talked about one of them, Cal exit. The others mentioned in that story, Vexit, Texit, NH exit, and Hoexit. Which one of those do you want to talk about?
What was the last one?
Hoexit. I believe that's how you would say a Hawaiian exit.
Oh, okay. Well, none of them have gotten anywhere close to off the ground at this particular point. You know, but my argument is these things happen fast, and when they happen, they come out of the blue. If I could respond to something the previous caller said about whether this would be violent, I talked about my experience in Quebec. We went through all of this. I saw it, and you know, that's kind of biased my thinking in terms of whether such a thing could happen here. What got talk of secession going in Quebec was something called Bill 101, which was frankly an anti-English piece of legislation. A lot of English people in Quebec. The English people didn't call it Bill 101, they called it Bill 401. 401 is a highway between Montreal and Toronto. About 300,000 English speakers in Quebec just moved to Toronto. So one of the things you'd expect to happen if there was something like this in America would be U-Haul would clean up. We'd sort ourselves out. We're doing it already, right? I mean, people are moving from California to Texas or Illinois to Texas or vice versa. There'd be more of that. And that's how you would solve things today, not through war. Too easy to get up and move.
Union, Washington. Glenn, good morning.
Hi, good morning. You know, I got a couple comments for your guests and a question. I'll be brief. You know, first of all, I holistically agree with what your guest is saying, especially the last statement. We don't need to go to war, but we do need to reconcile our deep differences ideologically as people. It has nothing to do with race, as the caller from Mississippi, didn't he say that the fabric of what keeps the U.S. together is keeping black people down? I thought that was pretty psychotic. Then the caller from California compared or coupled Donald Trump with capitalism. I agree with that. He represents freedom and capitalism. I'd invite him to look up Ayn Rand. She's dead now, but look up her institute and listen to her documentaries about capitalism and how important it is. I wanted to say that there's a person on YouTube that has a channel called Mark My Words, and he shows statistics and mathematics about our nation demographics. And he points out many social scientists that show that if Donald Trump is elected again, he will be the last Republican president, because minorities of immigrants vote over 2-1 for the Democratic Party. So mathematically, if the immigration continues, it will just be a matter of time until Republicans will not be elected. And the important point I'd like to point out to people that are objective is this. At the founding of the nation, and maybe your guest could confirm this, white people in the U.S. were 96 to 98% white in the colonies before we formed this country, and the remaining percentages were Native Americans and slaves. Well, we now have a nation where white people are 57% of the population. So I'd ask people that call white people racist or think the nation is racist against anyone that isn't white, how did we go from 98% to 96% unless the people, the framers who formed the nation, made sure that race was not an issue? And of course, we all know that they couldn't have put the territories together by abolishing slavery right out of the gate in the Constitution, because look at what happened with the Civil War. You know, the South, democratic governments, Democrats, tried to separate from the Union to hold on to slavery.
Glenn brings up a lot of points there.
A couple of points Glenn made I want to respond to. One, if I suspect he's a libertarian, and libertarians in particular might be tempted by the idea of secession. I mean, if they don't like the state, imagine the possibility of eliminating one entire level of government at a crack just like that, and the bad one too in their eyes. As for, the effect of immigration, well, it happened. It happened throughout the 19th century. I mean, all these people who at the time were thought to be completely undesirable, Irish people from Eastern Europe, whatever, they came here and they changed us. That's kind of an argument I hear from my friends on the left a lot, and it reminds me of the movie Cabaret. I don't know if you remember the song, "The Future Belongs to Me." So I think predicting the future is a bit of a mug's game, and I wouldn't get into that.
About 20 minutes left this morning as we talk about the book American Secession, The Looming Threat of National Breakup. The author, Frank Buckley, with us this morning. Two words I want you to define: nullification and interposition.
Nullification is basically a form of secession. The idea is, and it goes back to Thomas Jefferson, which, by the way, tells you a lot of the people that are revered American heroes are people who would have been sympathetic to some kind of secession. Nullification is the idea that a state can nullify a federal law. And if it could nullify one federal law, then it could nullify all of them, and that's secession. Interposition was something dreamt up by James Madison, Jefferson's friend, and it's a lot lighter. The idea is we're not saying we can nullify a law, only what we can do is get in the way. We're not going to help enforce a federal law in any way. That's exactly what's going on right now with sanctuary cities and sanctuary states like California that don't want to enforce immigration laws. So we're there already, and it's a game that's been played by, today, a lot of Democratic states, and in the past by Republican states. And it goes back indeed to the 1840s, where northern states did not want to enforce the fugitive slave laws. So that's, this is part of our history.
How does that game usually end?
Well, it plays out. The fugitive slave laws weren't much enforced, and that was a reason why the South was unhappy. Usually they don't go anywhere because we don't know exactly what it means. There was one flashpoint, though, which even reminded me of Fort Sumter a little bit. It was in Portland, Oregon. The ICE, the immigration people, had an office in Portland. They were stormed, or they were barricaded rather, by some Antifa people. They were holed up there and not permitted to escape. The Portland police didn't do anything to help them. They were only permitted to leave when federal marshals, U.S. federal marshals, were sent in to rescue them. That's not Fort Sumter, but it was remarkable.
Orangeburg, South Carolina. Mary, good morning.
Good morning. How are you, John and Mr. Buckley?
Doing well. Go ahead.
My question is, I kind of agree with what you're saying, Mr. Buckley, because as a child, I'm 74 now. As a child coming up, for some reason, I always thought I did live in two worlds because I didn't know I was black until I was told that I was black, and I was 5 years old at the time when I was told that. And the fact that the world has changed so much through the troubles that we went through with slavery and everything. And with a show that I watched last night, and I think everybody should see it. It was on MSNBC. It was the title was What's Eating America. I don't know if anybody heard of it or not, but it's something to watch. It has a lot to do with immigrants and documented, undocumented people, and it made me cry when I watched it. I'm still kind of crying about it now, how America has not really changed to respect people for who they are and not look at their color or their nationality. And I feel as though if we don't, as a people, don't get together and respect each other, we'll never solve the problem that's going in America today. Thank you.
Mary, there's a lot of truth in what you say, but don't you think that things have changed, particularly in South Carolina? I mean, when you were growing up, Strom Thurmond was the, senator, I guess. And Strom Thurmond changed over the years, and the civil rights revolution has really taken hold, hasn't it? I mean, in all of the states, in South Carolina. And if that's the case, then it seems to me secession should be thought of as less threatening because the stakes are so much lower. Back in 1861, it was a big deal. And the war was properly and justly fought to eliminate slavery. But we don't have those kinds of horrible big issues today. You know, we've gone through the '65 Civil Rights Act, and nobody's really much trying to undo that. You know, we're going to quarrel about things, but when you get down to it, don't you think that the quarrels are over things that are a lot less important than they were in 1965 and 1865? So I think we're more united about a lot of important issues. And what's dividing us, frankly, in many cases seems, far less important.
Janet in Florida on Twitter comes back to secession light. Says, it just sounds like a plan to permit red states to go their own way in regard to civil rights. We're either the United States of America or we are not.
Well, that's kind of the voice of liberal triumphism. In other words, it's our country, we have property rights to it, and this is what Irving Kristol was saying in 1992. The left won the culture wars, and they didn't quite. Now, you know, we're not talking about, I mean, I think it would help if one spent more time talking to people who you disagree with, because I think you'd find that they're not benighted racists. But they are people who might have different points of view about things like, for example, abortion. That's perfectly fine. I see nothing wrong with that. If that's your definition of an unacceptable difference, then we have to disagree.
Another quote from your book, other countries have their common cultures or religions. What America has is an idea that constitutes our identity as Americans, and that idea is a liberalism in the classical sense. If we are to resist the call to secession, it is our allegiance to our country's liberal principles that will unite us.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of talk about nationalism in conservative circles right now, and mostly there are people who, you know, want to tell you, no, it's, you know, we're more than a creed, we're a people. But I want to say, no, we are a creed, we're a liberal creed. I mean, American nationalism is liberal nationalism, and if you're American, you know, you have to subscribe to the basic truths, you know, outlined in the Declaration, and if you don't do that, then to my mind, you're something less than an American. And if, you know, people who do that eventually reveal themselves to be out of sync with what America's all about.
What is America all about?
Well, America's all about the principles found in the Declaration more than in the Constitution that preach liberty and equality. And those are pretty good values.
Folsom, California. This is Denise. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. Mr. Buckley, I have been thinking about the fact that the 2000 Bush-Gore election and the 2016 election between Trump and Hillary Clinton both went for the Republican candidate in lieu of the idea that there really were more majority Democrat voters. So that thinking, that one person gets one vote, has really been on my mind lately. And I discovered that California has over 40 million people now, and we have 2 senators that represent us. And likewise, the state of Vermont, and there are many others whose populations are less than 1 million. And they also have 2 senators. So I felt like the power of my vote is really diminished by virtue of the fact that I live in a very populous state. And then to take that thought one step further, and I hope my sourcing was right on this, but I read recently that the impeachment vote was in favor of conviction by only, I think it was 47 senators, but they represented 169 million people. Those who voted to quit Trump, represented 151 million people. So it's roughly 18 million people fewer. So I feel like the power of my vote, my one vote per person, is really diminished based on historical facts in the last 20 years.
Denise, you're absolutely right. Your vote is diminished, and what we're observing here in the Constitution is a conflict between what I think is a kind of a basic norm of democracy on the one hand versus the way the Constitution got worked out with the Electoral College. And if that's your problem right now, I can well imagine how you will feel if, as I expect, Donald Trump is reelected in 2020 this year and maybe gets a few more seats on the Supreme Court. And I think at that point, maybe people will want to say, no, we respect democracy, and that means secession.
Connecticut, this is Gary. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I wanted to speak to the notion of secessionism as a sleeper issue, resulting from the failure of Reconstruction and the failure to properly punish the traitors who raised their hand against the Constitution of the United States and the government of the United States. There have been, during Reconstruction, slowly but surely, blacks were suppressed. Jim Crow laws came into being. Southerners still refer to the war as the War of Northern Aggression and the Lost Cause. And these people have been waiting to have a voice, and they now have one in the President of the United States. If you look to the issue of monuments, I don't know if you're aware of the Colfax Massacre in Louisiana, but there's a monument to 3 white racists who participated in the massacre of 150 black women and children. And it says, it is here where Northern carpetbagging ended. So we have monuments to people who were murderers and unrepentant traitors. And I really think that's where this is going. I think Davis should have been hung, not have a boulevard named after him, and many of the monuments themselves are inappropriate.
Well, you're right. The prosecution of Jefferson Davis was pulled in 1868. He spent 2 years in prison. I don't honestly think that had he been prosecuted, life would be much different today. I mean, he was prosecuted. I mean, if he had been convicted and sent to a term in prison, how would that make your life or my life any different today? You're right about Reconstruction being a failed project. It took another 100 years before we began to remedy that. On the other hand, it seems to me if that's how you regard, half of Americans, then you have to ask if you want to be in the same country as them.
Just about 5 minutes left with Frank Buckley. American Secession is the book, the looming threat of national breakup. We'll try to get to as many of your calls as we can in that time. Richard's been waiting out in Boulder, Colorado. Good morning.
Hello. Hey, I just have a couple. Are you there?
Yep.
Yeah, I have a couple comments on a few views of secession that I see going on right now in the country. Basically, it's the minimum wage. If you look at all the red states and you go state by state, most of them are at 25 an hour, and the blue states, the purple states, have been raising the minimum wages. That's like Washington, D.C. is close to $15 an hour. Colorado's $12 an hour, and $12 to $13 an hour in Denver. And then the other form of secession I see is the separation of church and state, which we have been losing. And in our Constitution, it is freedom from religion, freedom of religion. And in the mid-50s, you know, they decided in the 1950s to put on the dollar bill, "In God We Trust." And God was never on the money until that period of, oh, we got to be scared about communism. And we never had the word God in the Pledge of Allegiance until the 1950s. It was written by a socialist in the early 1900s. So that's...
Richard, we're running out of time. So what's your question?
That is two forms of succession that I see that the states have been succeeding in the change of minimum wage.
Well, actually, that's a good thing by my view. I mean, let them decide whatever they want. If they raise the minimum wage too high and you get a lot of unemployment, maybe they'll think better of it. But you know, the issues you're talking about are mostly issues that are within the province of state power. That's fine.
Alvin is in Jackson, Florida. Good morning. You're next.
Yes, I just wanted to make a statement concerning the issue of secession. And as the earlier caller from Colorado stated, you know, that it's a complex of issues and people. I think you know, the globalists cause these things, just like the proprietors, those that come from England, especially in the southern state of South Carolina. If you look at it, you will see that they were looking at it, the investor class was looking at it from an investment standpoint, notwithstanding the fact that they had to deal with the king, George III in England, concerning he wanting a part of the correction of the Stamp Act. So it was the oligarchs that caused these problems and the commingling of people in their situation, and so we got it today. It's the globalists that cause these problems, you know, cause people to, you know, to be infuriated, to be against each other.
Well, I'm glad you got talking about the George III, because if you don't like secession, what do you think about 1776? That was secession, after all. We just exited the Great Britain and the Empire.
Are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful that we won't have a secession. Yeah. Even if it doesn't help for my book sales.
Why?
Because I hope that Americans will, at the end of the day, say, this is nuts. We're dividing over things we should be agreeing about importantly. And when we disagree, we should do so civilly and with moderation. I'm hoping that happens.
Time for maybe one or two more calls. John, here in Washington, D.C. Good morning.
Good morning, C-SPAN, and good morning to your guests. My name is John. I'm here to ask your guest concerning, I've caught the tail end of his comments about Confederate statues or other callers calling in, citing that. And also the Civil War era. I'm writing policy for the repayment of wages to black Americans for the injury of slavery in this country. We've been confused for a while. This country does not owe us reparations. It owes us compensation and benefits denied to, individuals known as enslaved people who just so happen to be part black, part Native American. As you know, as slavery, there was a lot of forced sexual contact going on. We are looking at removing all of your Confederate statues throughout this country because it represents treason, it represents murder, it represents slavery, and there's no part of your heritage legally that you have standing to keep that up when you fought against the United States of America. And I must tell you that the end of the public visual impact is over. Even in our courts, we have statues of John Marshall, who owned slaves. That is totally unnecessary. We don't see a statue of Adolf Hitler in the plaza of a courtyard, or Mussolini, or modern day. Let's look at Saddam Hussein. Do you think we would erect statues up of him?
Got your point, John.
You know, a Frenchman, Ernest Renan, defined nationalism as people who have the same kind of history, but also the same kind of amnesia. They've forgotten things. I think that America's messy and requires compromise and requires something like less than total victory on one side or the other. I mean, that's exactly what compromise is. So I like messiness. Messiness works for me. It's absolutely essential if you keep the country together.
In our last minute or so, you're a law school professor. What do your students think about this issue and the threat of secession?
Well, we haven't gotten into it. I mean, I don't want to keep those issues before them, but you know, as much as possible, if you're a law professor, the students should not have a clue what your politics are. I try to keep it that way.
Do they read your books?
I hope they will.
Are you going to have a conversation at some point in the year on this topic?
I have a class on the on the framers' debates, and yeah, we'll talk about it. It's there.
Frank Buckley is the author of the book American Secession, The Looming Threat of a National Breakup, joining us this morning on the Washington Journal. We always appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
And up next on the Washington Journal, it's the first stop of a week-long joint Washington Journal American History TV series focusing on D.C. area museums, highlighting collections that explore the American story on this President's Day. We'll be joined next by Douglas Bradburn. He's the president CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon. He's going to be joining us from the Mount Vernon Museum and Education Center. But before we take you there this morning, and you're seeing live pictures on your screen now, we're going to show you part of a panel discussion that took place at Mount Vernon, accompanied C-SPAN's book release, the book The Presidents, last year. Historian Doug Brinkley, in that discussion, talked about what he would say to George Washington if he had the chance to meet him today.
What would you want to say to George Washington? Welcome, Mr. President. What would you say you liked about what he did, or you didn't like what he did?
I would say thank you. Thank you for what you did during the American Revolution. Thank you for being General Washington. Thank you for stepping down from the presidency instead of turning it into a dictatorship or a government of tyranny. He was able to say, I've done my term, I've got to leave, you've got to pick a successor. I mean, I would thank him for the character he had, for the integrity, the fact that if we didn't have him, I don't know if we would have made it as the United States, because you needed a figure people could believe in, and Washington provided that. So there's really no larger person in American history than George Washington. So my gratitude towards him, my cup would runneth over. With that said, there's this dark side of slavery, which they're deal with very well now at Mount Vernon, and they're trying all the time to understand that that dark spot of being from Virginia in that particular period of time. But we've got to watch we don't get too much of the disease of presentism, meaning what we think everything today has to be done, you know, hundreds of years in a certain way. I think Washington's is, as a Flexner biography, indispensable man. And it's hard to imagine we could have been a country without having Washington's battlefield heroics. They still teach them at West Point. If you want to understand military history, look at Washington's campaign in New Jersey and the Hudson River, etc. It's quite remarkable.
Washington Journal continues.
from the ground of George Washington's historic Mount Vernon